perde 4%. Tiene.
The internationalization of property rights law makes it harder for us to create the technologies that save lives and mitigate suffering, and make it harder for us to disseminate the technology that saves lives and mitigates suffering. The first thing I'll do in this speech is describe some setup with the contrast between the two benches will be in the debate. I will then make two arguments. Firstly, about how these agreements are often very coercive and often limit people's ability to access important technologies that keep them safe from disease or from lack of food, and then also explain why we still get considerable, probably even more innovation on the side government house. So, first thing in terms of setup, I think we all understand and agree internationalization of property rights obviously occurs to property rights becoming universally applicable and enforceable across multiple jurisdictions, not just in the jurisdiction with which the original license originated, where this thing also refers to the creation of large organizations full of technical experts, as we'll talk about a little later. Many of them would have necessarily had to have been educated and kind of cut their teeth in the places where the most sophisticated IP law is practiced, which is to say in the West, and therefore that shapes the way that they would do this. The third thing we'd also point out is obviously as internationalization, this kind of more just context in terms of framing the debate, we also point out that obviously as internationalization and people enter internationalization agreements, the agreements they make in the initial set, starting to 2.0, obviously make it harder to go back and fix any problems that might occur later, because you have to undo an entire set of legal arguments and precedent and legal structures there, which means that a lot of the decisions that get made early on are likely to be quite sticky on into the future. The final thing, just in terms of the counterfactual and the alternative, we think obviously the burden of governments is to defend a world where it's not internationalized, so presumably countries can still maintain their own international property laws domestically. We also would be supportive of states, if they so choose, to encourage innovation through alternate forms of innovation encouragement, which say things like prizes, not which is to say, instead of offering the company that comes up with a life-saving drug a monopoly, a legal monopoly, i.e. an IP, a patent on that, but instead saying, if you create a medicine that solves a particular disease, we'll give you a certain amount of prize money that investors can pay for. So, I'll make two arguments. Before I get there, I just want to briefly touch on what matters the most, which is to say, we think in this debate, by far the most important thing is to alleviate the often tremendous amounts of physical suffering that people have and experience with things like, being suffering from HIV/AIDS, the fact that they lose relatives, the fact they often experience home instability, the fact they experience hunger when crops in the agricultural sector in their country is not particularly efficient and doesn't grow crops at the level that needs to be. And we think these genuine, principled, embodied things matter far more than any abstraction, like, for example, the right that these companies or innovators might have to collecting rents on their innovation. Because one, we make the simple version, you can't eat a right, and human beings need to eat things. But two, to the extent we care about rights, obviously the rights of these people not experience these harms matters far more than the ability of other people to experience, to receive payment. So, let's now talk about why the internationalization of property rights causes human misery, in particular with respect to disseminating important forms of technology, like, for example, particular forms of fertilizer that allow crops to grow more efficiently, or life-saving medicines that will allow people to live longer if they have a genetic disease like HIV/AIDS. We would point to the fact that most valuable intellectual property is produced in advanced economies, almost by definition because they are advanced, right? That is where the tremendous amount of the high-end, highly capitalized research or big name, big dollar human capital goes to produce a tremendous amount of those key innovations. It's why those countries are advanced. They're the furthest along the supply chain. We can point to companies like Moderna and the creation of the COVID-19 vaccine. The perfect example of the exact sort of dynamic that we're talking about that. The next thing that happens in the status quo is that these life-saving drugs, these things that greatly enhance agricultural productivity or keep people safe from diseases or mosquitoes or whatever, people obviously around the world want them because they're incredibly futile, and developing countries in particular want them because they often have the people who suffer the most from those easily preventable diseases, or they have the most people who are poor and can't afford necessarily other treatments. And what we would point to here is that given that they can't produce the way in which the laws of these works is, one, they tend to set up a factory that produces a particular drug, for example, in a generic sense, like the way that many, because obviously India, for example, has plenty of factories that can produce plenty of pharmaceutical drugs, but they can't produce generic. But if they try and set up a factory that produces generics, they often get sanctioned by Western states as a result of being a part of these treaties. And of course, the other thing is as well is they simply just have to pay the price that the IP holders ask for, because that's what they have agreed to by being a part of these treaties and through this internationalization process. Obviously, international property is a legal monopoly, which means that the direct economic incentive of these guys, of the IP holders, like for example large pharmaceutical companies, is to suppress the quantity sold and increase the price. Well, that's the profit maximizing point that you would have studied in Econ 101. That means that they deliberately restrict the amount that gets sent out to people. Because these nations either have very low social safety nets or just very limited ability to publicly fund their healthcare systems, that means that consumers either have to pay directly for these drugs or directly or agricultural producers and firms have to try and purchase these things directly. Because the monopoly holders and the patent holders place a very high price on them because they want to extract as much rent as possible, that means they cannot afford it in the vast majority of circumstances. And there's just very little of these licensing tech goes out. They can't make investments on the things that they're spending money on these licenses. Or the government, if the government tries to buy it themselves, the government can't order enough because it will bankrupt, or it would not bankrupt, but like it put a lot of strain on their budget, it limits their ability to do other things. They can't buy as much. That means that people are sicker for longer. It means food is produced less effectively. These economies grow slower. Given the agricultural sector is the largest sector in the developing world, that is an incredible thing to hang around the neck of these developing countries. I'll take a point of information from closing.
Right, so IP only prevents you from actually mimicking the exact pattern or object that has already been in the market. Why exactly does it prevent you from feeding people then?
Oh, well, the first and most simple observation is that often the way in which these is forced legally is to massively try and scope creep the extent to which people you try and use these patterns. Like, for example, you maybe make a drug that's very similar and you experience yourself in a tremendous amount of court with very high amounts of legal fees, so you don't necessarily push that particular thing. The second observation you make is like sometimes you just need a particular thing that's particular, like a particular kind of drug, a particular kind of vaccine, for instance, that is particularly effective, you can't get access to it. Why, however, does innovation hurt more under our side? So I've already shown that the dissemination of these important stuff does affect millions of people more under our side compared to theirs. But even into the future, innovation occurs more on the government side. There are three reasons for that. One, firstly, obviously, actors still have incentives to innovate. If you're the first to create a drug, it's tremendously brand value for you. You can sell it first. You have tremendous first move advantage. Often recoup your investment that way. Two, we also point out many innovators do not actually capture the benefit of their initial investment through IP law, but they still innovate anyway, suggesting that there are other things like the status of someone who produces something important, or it's often the offset of other industrial process that you're doing. But the final thing you point out is IP is often, the way that Western companies often use IP is they use it to buy out other people's IP and prevent other people from innovating and protecting them, which is often anti-competitive and prevents competition. For those reasons, how much better being on that side.
I thank the Prime Minister and invite the leader of the opposition to address the House. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition will not stand in a world where culture, symbols of struggle, war, and oppression are used for profit, in which none of the benefits are funneled back to the most vulnerable people on the ground. OG tells us rights doesn't matter because you can't eat it. Don't let them get away with this one-liner that somehow washes culture out of this debate. Right? Because if the Black Lives Matter fist can one day be put on a Louis Vuitton bag for profit, that is a world in which this debate must fall. Before that, let's quickly take OG out of this debate. Because notice, panel, that all of their impacts and benefits come from this simple mechanization of, the state will give these companies prize money if they can cater to the needs of people on the ground instead of a profit. Instead of profit. So for this to be a wash, like OG claims, the prize money then has to equal the profit made by these companies for this thing to be a wash. Insofar as that is possible under their world, it's extremely unclear to be in open opposition. Why can't they just subsidize the technology that they claim they need so much? We will prove to you specifically why only with legislation and internationalization on our side will we actually get these positive things that opening government just assert they will get. Before I move on, some framing. So who's this art actually getting stolen from? I think this is a crucial piece that opening government just didn't tell us. We tell you it's likely going to be poorer individuals from unknown cultures, people who have smaller market shares, and there's less incentive to steal and pirate less known designs and less known culture, because there is less backlash when these people are first. They don't know you steal their art because you live so far across the world and they don't have access to you stealing their art. But second, they don't have the capacity to do anything about it when you do. Because it's likely these big people, like Britney Spears, stealing and sampling songs directly from Hindi culture. And we tell you that the people on the ground didn't even know that, and for a very long time we tell you this is incredibly harmful. Note that this characterization deals with OG's give prize money thing. Because if they can't just give prize money, the debate just becomes very uncompetitive. 5 layers of framing of how this actually works and looks like in our world. First, the formation of like a universal body that is like regulating all the countries. Second, we tell it enforcement of law, so this looks like fine, jail terms, or like blacklisting or removing licenses. Third, we tell that we can fiat this is enforced to a degree for this to work. Fourth, we tell that there's likely to be a ledger for those who do these arts. If they pirate art, they're likely to be put on blacklist and people can see who are this art, that people who are doing it, so like criminals can be put on a ledger. Fifth, we say that there is precedence for this actually happening in the real world. I was studying for my final Z library just got taken down by the US, and we tell you in these cases that it's not very hard to do if they want to pay. It's just taking something off the web, and it's as simple as that. Two arguments to posit that. First, how art stolen on the ground harms people both practically but also principally. Second argument deals with them, how value positive art being pirated leads to more harm to minorities, directly clashing opening government on their burden that they want to prove. First, how stealing art harms people on the ground. The problem is that Western nations are the people who like steal ideas of art. This looks like Tarantino films being stolen from Bollywood people, and he makes a lot of money off that. People don't want that threat, so they are always likely to steal from people, while smaller people don't have the capacity or knowledge to defend themselves. We tell you that this is harmful in two practical ways. First, economic harm. Because individuals in smaller nations have no way, first of all, to get a big royalty. They are like unlikely to have a big market share. This means not a lot of agents or companies or labels are likely going to be catering to them. So every cent that goes to them counts. The moment in which you pirate their art is the moment where you're directly taking money out of the pockets of these people. We tell you they also have a smaller market, and smaller artists lose money from works that they directly generate. Money that would have gone to them is stolen from bigger people in opening government's world. We tell you secondly, there is an unequal gain in wealth, because this is not some Robin Hood scenario, right? This is not where the smaller artists are stealing from bigger artists to support themselves. No, this is direct, like bigger artists like coming to small artists and say, oh, give me your money, right? Rich people make more money at the expense of the poor people, and this is just something we don't think OG can like contend with. And if government wants to have a chance in this debate, they have to engage with us on the things like symbols, rights, and arts. We tell utilitarianism just by a basic fact that if you give $1 to a poor artist, they're likely to value it much more than a rich artist. And this rich artist has many more avenues to gain wealth compared to this poor artist. So we think when you steal, when you're in a position of privilege, and where power dynamic stands, is incredibly harmful to the people on the ground. That leads to the principle, right? Because stolen art looks like things like designs of clothes or paintings. This is like batik designs in Malaysia, or Chinese symbols, like people just simply put on clothing. There's a lack of incentive to tell people what these things authentically mean on the ground. Because once you make the profit, you're just going to go. You're not going to, attach cards to your clothes and be, this is why these symbols existed in the past. The principal harm here is threefold. First, it's immoral because people hold claim to these symbols. They've gone through war, it's their culture. They hold on to it to signs of suffering, right? People don't and can't consent to being profited on. Because these big people are likely to just come take their art and go off. There's no no checks and balances to it. And the person pirating is unlikely to need it in the first place. Second, the belittling of importance in cultures and symbols. We tell that the people who are pirating this art don't respect the symbols that the people who are most vulnerable claim onto. They're likely to change the meaning, and it's going to be very like, this art is so exotic, you should buy into it, instead of telling people about the culture of how it goes on the ground. But most importantly, nothing goes back to these poor people. Everything is likely to be channeled back to these people who are just pirating the art. Before I move on, closing?
Yeah, so if someone steals something, and it's patented in, for example, a developing nation, you just sue them in the developing nation.
I think you just sue them in the developing nation.
Yeah, you sue them wherever you register the patent.
Yeah, but suing is like a lot easier in our case. I don't really understand. I think I'm second speaker will do it. But the second argument then is with how value positive art being pirated leads to more harm to minorities. They claim the only way they get better things like technology and education, this is absent of symbols or culture. We tell you these things look like education and these things look like healthcare, right? We tell you the moment in which there is no legislation, the people who have the capacity to make technology, to make education, aren't going to come into these developing nations in the first place because there's no way for them to make a profit. Because their works are going to be pirated. It becomes a public good. We uniquely, on opening opposition, give them security that the moment you come into it, there is going to be a backing on a global scale to protect your products. We can ensure that you come in and you can make a profit. Insofar as the biggest companies that give the highest quality education and technology for the lowest price are likely to be those who are profit incentivized. These are very people we need to attract them on the outside, and only can we attract them on the outside when we give them the security and stability. Second, on technology, they say, we tell you that first of all, if you are going to pirate it, it's not going to be the rosy people that they claim to be, because they can't defend the government or just give them prize money. It's likely going to be pirated. We say this leads to lower quality. They'll have a lack of resources, lack of expertise, lack of institutionalism ready to receive this technology, which is at their best, even if they get it prioritized for free and the government doesn't have to give prize money, is likely to be worse off in the long run. We, on our side, we allow there to be an incentive to be able to cater to these people on the ground. We give a profit incentive for these companies to come in. We allow for political pressure to lead to social change, because people can now call out a problem and tell this big body of people, hey, you are limiting the ability for these minorities to get the things they need. And that's only possible when there is a global backing, when there is institutionalization that surrounds it. For those reasons,
Hi, thank you for the opposition. Just one small thing. I know you all have to communicate. Just try and whisper slightly more quietly. It's not a big thing revolving there, but yeah, just quick of that. Right. Without any further ado, Deputy Prime Minister, you have the floor.
The globalization of international property law has absolutely and will continue to bring people more harm than it has good. Because, similar to what this team was able to tell you, the only people that profit from ridiculously strong and Western imported IP law are the people who can have a claim of ownership over something in order to milk like millions of dollars worth of profit out of it. That's an incredibly small group of people in this debate. They're not a particularly a group of people that we really care about, especially considering that the examples that they use in that speech were about examples of things like cultural art and cultural symbols, which are highly unlikely to be able to be patented by anybody in this debate. There would not be one individual artist who would be able to patent, for example, a symbol of Buddhist peace and produce tourist goods on that and therefore make a lot of money from that. Also, there are no examples of anybody using IP law from developed nations in a way to get incredibly rich. You cannot name a CEO, you cannot name an incredibly rich artist from one of these nations. Globalization has not made them rich. It has instead given the West an ability to further increase the inequality between developed and developing nations. It has instead given people who come up with an idea first the right to make millions and millions of dollars and to fundamentally change that product in a way that means it helped less people, and that was why it definitely brought more harm than good. So firstly, explaining what is the opportunity cost of internationalised IP, because noting that this debate will be won in 3 days, in 3 ways by opening government. First, we prove that internationalised IP law brings harms. Second, we mitigate the small goods that OO team tells you it brings. And thirdly, we tell you it comes at an opportunity cost. So starting with the opportunity cost. When you have internationalised IP law, it gets imported through forcing people to sign on to treaties in a way that sort of says, we think that intellectual property should be universally inalienable. It says to you that if you have a patent on something that is true the world over and you are able to do that in any jurisdiction, no matter if that would have been the way that IP law was developed in that system of law. Think of if a different law from the West was able to apply to the entire world like this. Just imagine if the law that we have in Australia that was voted on by our lawyers and set by our precedents, we then sent through a treaty to the rest of the world and this big fancy organisation and forced them to sign onto. That is principally going to come at a huge opportunity cost of the development of a spectrum of precedents in which we could create a robust IP system which all of humanity finds to be useful. And note, importantly, useful IP law isn't necessarily incredibly strong and inalienable IP law. It's on the burden of this opposition bench to prove to you that when IP law is incredibly strong and can be applied in any jurisdiction, and that people can never have that technology ever copied, that is a good thing for humanity and produces more harm than good, which we think is incredibly unlikely. We also think that what this does is it entrenches the Western standards of owning things, which have clearly led to catastrophe for humanity. Think about climate change, think about the pandemic, think about a lot of things which we had technology that we could have used to reduce the humanitarian downfall from, but we didn't because of greedy people, greedy companies, pharmaceutical companies, and creators of technologies who just happen to own the patent, not doing what they should have done for humanity. We live in a world where green technology has not been able to spread as fast as it could have if it could have had more competition, if people could have been copying those designs from the first day that they were ever designed. It would have been more improved by now, it would exist in more countries, it would be less expensive to access, and it would be produced in a lot of different places, right? That's the kind of thing, that is an idea that would potentially be significantly more beneficial to humanity, but the globalization and internationalization of IP has actively stopped from happening. So we think that on our side of the house, no, we don't just have prizes that incentivize innovation. Governments have the ability and the incentive to produce protection for innovators in a way that allows them to participate in global trade. But no one government gets to say that there is a universally inalienable perception of IP law, and each individual suing case or each individual argument of copyright or whatever it is happens in that specific jurisdiction according to the laws in that country, according to the way that it was set up in that country. And we tell you that it's far more likely to respect minorities, that it's far more likely to be set up in a way that is good for humanity, because the way that it is done now is not necessarily a benefit in today's debate. Sure.
Does IP law and status quo protect ownership in perpetuity?
So that plays really well into my next argument about why the universalization of IP protection is actually going to make perpetuity and problems of IP law not ever lapsing significantly worse. Because what this speaker will want to tell you is look, it doesn't matter if IP law applies everywhere because a patent expires eventually and we get that competition. We tell you on our side of the house that specifically internationalizing IP law makes it clunkier, harder to reform, and strengthens narratives from rich people that say we deserve to keep our patents forever, and is actively bad for getting that type of competition that we support on our side of the house. So, is universal IP protection enough of a good thing to outweigh the harms? We tell you firstly, internationalization lengthens IP timelines because it makes it seem like it should be an inalienable right, and it makes lawyers literally get educated in a world where they think IP is so important that it must apply over and above any one country's individual system of law or individual jurisdiction simply because they signed a treaty. That is the strongest possible perception of how important these laws could be, and is a very strong argument for people who have vested interest in trying to keep their patents forever. Noting that specifically, they can use this organisation and this global system to make sneaky changes and get a first mover advantage that allow them to do things like find ways to keep patents alive for significantly longer than was intended to, and in a way that wasn't in the interest of humanity. What this does, importantly, is it leads to higher costs of products, because it means that you are more likely to have the advantages of a patent and a lack of competition across the entire world, which means you never get a competitor who will produce a similar or the same product and therefore compete with you on other things. We think it would be far more valid if there was competition on things like the production of the technology, after the intellectual property was developed, because we think that in the same way that other businesses are allowed to compete on areas of industry that don't have anything to do with IP, like one service company with another service company, we think that one vaccine producer and another vaccine producer should be able to compete. They'll make each other produce faster, better, safer, in more globally robust ways, and that was something that we get on our side of the house. They tell me that look, if people are innovating specifically for profit, then we need to try and maximize that profit to get them to innovate. But we tell you that this actually ruins the innovations because it forces them to design products that are inaccessible. It inherently incentivizes them to make their products have limited supply so that they can drive up the price, and it creates patent races and things that don't necessarily lead to innovations or ideas landing on the ground unless it can make anybody any money. If you want to protect the boundaries and you want to get more harm than good, it's not about consuming or producing art. It's about saving climate change, it's about getting people medicine, and it's about reducing the inalienable perception of the idea that we should own technology.
Thanks to Deputy Prime Minister. I invite Deputy Leader of the Opposition to take the floor.
First, I'll deal with technology and probably education, which is likely what the government talks about. I've talked about the strategic implications of our case, which is seen to disregard entirely. First, I think Jaden already told you why it doesn't make sense that states are going to give an incentive. We hear from the DPM that no, because when you give them a profit incentive, they're purposefully going to make things that are exclusionary. But then, if that was the case, why is it not the case that you could also give the same things together at the same time you give them subsidies or you give them prize money for these things? The reason is because people are more likely to turn towards profit incentive incentives than the limited amount of prize money that you can give. But also, I don't think that you can just assert that people just want to do this for some altruistic reason. A lot of reasons, like maybe I as a scientist, I really want to make these things, but I need funding in the first place. And the people who like to give me funding in most instances are private companies who want to have that funding in first instance. You can assert that developing countries, as bad as you characterize them, are going to be able to give people this funding. But also, I don't see any positive case on their side, because they need to contend with the fact that there's going to be systemically less inventions and systemically less innovation on their side. No, because they can't just say that, oh, innovation on our side is exclusive, because innovation on our side at least exists. That is to say that at least some people are going to get it. But also in terms of education, which I think likely is going to be a closing opposition extension, but closing government, but if you want to give one, no. Okay, why is that also not within this debate? Because the point at which you allow people to make profit out of these things is when they're going to distribute these things within Malaysia, within India. The only reason why we get the distribution of Cambridge A-level books within Malaysia and within India is because they see that they can make a profit from that. Then you can't say that it's exclusive, because what this leads to is educational institutions buying these books, reading up these books, and making maybe summarized versions of these books in a way that doesn't infringe copyright, but also allows people on the ground to have some sort of access towards these books. This type of mechanization cannot happen on their side when there's no reason for them to disseminate this information and disseminate these types of educational things within these countries in the first place. Because you cannot just assert that there are people out there who care about people, because we've seen so far that people don't. That private companies and capitalism have bred an environment where the only way that you can care about people is to make sure that there is a profit being made. That is the only way that we can incentivize some sort of benefit coming down to these people, when we make sure that there is some sort of profit mechanism incentivizing the capitalist structures to help these people at the end of the day. And we don't think it will be ridiculously high like they say, because in most instances, if you want to make the most profit, you need to create at least some sort of tiered producting range. That you say you need to have some light versions of the product as well that is going to be applicable to the majority of the population that they assert somehow are excluded from this. I don't see that as a very charitable case.
Point.
But secondly, I'll take closing with that one. I'm not going to take opening on this. They need to engage with this principal harm on minority intellectual property. Because closing government tries to say that, oh, they could just do it in their own domestic courts. But the problem is, most of the times, it is these Western institutions that are stealing from these minority countries. Why is this the case? When we saw sampling rising within music in the West, they couldn't sample other Western artists because they knew that there was copyright art there. That is the point at which they turned to Asian art and they said, we are going to sample these things, because nothing is stopping us from doing that, because we can do it for free. It's literally free range for us, it's free real estate. The problem why this is suddenly a harm is because these Asian countries don't see that harm happening to them, because that isn't happening within their country. There's external countries taking it from them. And you can't just sue them within your own country where there's external parties who are doing this in the first place. I don't think CGSPOI makes a lot of sense. OG then says, but we don't see people getting very rich out of these lawsuits. And we say that it's very likely that the reason we don't see people getting rich is, one, because there's a huge disincentive for that to happen. But two, when we do see these clothing brands now using Asian art as graphic designs in their t-shirts, they now have to pay royalties to those artists in those countries. We see this happening all the time with artists in Japan and artists in Malaysia. But secondly, you need to engage with the principal harm in and of itself. Because even if it's not just that actual symbols within these cultures, most of these art that comes from Asian countries and whatever developing countries are based on those art, based on the symbols and based on those cultures. So even if it isn't those direct instances of stealing those symbols, it is likely stealing them through this commutative property. Why is it then something that is bad? Because you are saying to these individuals that we are taking your symbols, using it for profit, and we don't care about the meaning of your symbol. We don't care about the meaning, that significance that you allocate to that symbol, because it doesn't mean anything to us Westerners. We say that this is something of a principal harm insofar as you're telling them it doesn't matter what these individuals think, it is what we think that matters. Closing.
Right. So on our side of the world, companies can still sell in these individual countries by registering foreign IP there, but also competing with other companies within those local countries.
You also gave reasons why they can compete with IP when the IP exists, so I don't see why there is something that's going to likely exist. When you yourselves in opening government say that it's likely that when you have intellectual property, competition can happen because it's crazy, then you say you can come here, form your own domestic IP and competition can happen. You can't engage on that comparison. But secondly, why is it likely that we increase the amount of intellectual property rights happening within these countries in the first place? Because we see a lot of time, before we had this universalization and internationalization of intellectual property, it's very likely that many developing countries didn't even have these policies in the first place because they didn't see a harm in the first place. It is only when Western countries came to them for their own profit incentive, firstly, to come and say we need these kinds of intellectual property rights here, that they themselves have those intellectual property rights. Why is this important? Because it's a prerequisite to any of those defensive mechanizations coming from closing government, that there's some sort of domestic policies here. Because we are the ones that encourage those policies to exist in the first place, the point at which we impose them onto these countries. But also, only when the point at which we allow these countries to have these types of policies is when they aren't going to fall to all the harms that we explained to you when it comes to art. But we understand maybe art isn't as important for people's survival. But insofar as we've already proven to you that the amount of technology and education is going to be less incentivized on their side, we can also talk about the principal harm, which I feel is much, much more important than not allowing these individuals to live dignified lives and have a dignified interpretation of their own culture and asserting that interpretation, their Western interpretation, onto them. What are the reasons why opening opposition takes this debate? I think we fundamentally break down the premises at which they say they're going to help people on the ground more. Because the only premise that they have left standing is that people are generally altruistic and there will be some actor who fundamentally wants to help people survive at the end of the day. While this sounds like a great thing happening, we rarely see this happening in status quo, because even if those actors do exist, they don't get the funding unless they can prove some sort of profit that they can make somebody for it. They use some semantic tricks here and say, oh, but they can get a first mover's advantage instead. First mover's advantage is talking about profit also. I don't think this is going to cut it for opening government. Closing government likely falls to this as well. Why is closing opposition unlikely going to be able to extend from this? Because they are likely going to extend in the realm of technology and education. Insofar as opening opposition strategically weighs that out of the debate and weighs it as something that's unlikely going to be a contribution from opposition and talks about something more principled and something more dignified to these individuals, we are likely going to take it over them as well. They are happy to take our government teams. Proud of
Thank you, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I invite the Member of the Government to address the House.
All right. Deal. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, for arguments to win your debate, they have to be both true and relevant. OG suffers because they couldn't prove what they said was true, i.e. they weren't able to actually mechanize why things like insulin prices are so different in the United States versus developing nations with relatively weaker patent laws. And OO wasn't able to prove what they said was relevant because on the scale of impacts, I think even in the worst case scenario where there is widespread theft of things like culture, I think it's unlikely that on either side of the world you're able to deal with that. Let's quickly deal with the culture thing. First of all, the simple response is you can't copyright culture. Copyright requires direct proof that you created originally whatever it is you are patenting. The second response is that, in general, for reasons I'm going to actually explain, not just to start like OG, the West tends to have the strictest forms of patent law. And to get a patent in the first place, you have to do a lot of work to prove that you originally created it. You have to show drafts, you have to show designs. Literally, sometimes you have to show texts to other coworkers proving you were talking about this idea in the first place. So unless you can do that for cultural things that you were stealing from another culture, then you cannot get IP, you can't even get a patent for these things in the first place in the global north. So someone couldn't produce a movie that has stolen stuff in it because you patented a movie, and if it has stolen things in it, you can't get the patent. So ultimately what that means, panel, is you were unlikely to be able to address cultural theft on the opposition bench, making their case irrelevant. So let's prove the actual burden on the government case here. We're going to explain the way patent law currently works and why it allows for developing nations the greatest amount of agency for choosing the balance. Because where you place your patent law on the spectrum of really strict to really loose is actually really beneficial, both for essentially choosing between, do you want to be somewhere where people invent things or where people produce things? Here's how this works. So panel, when we talk about different types of patent law, it looks like, for example, the burden of proof metric. In places like the United States, like I said, you have, if you sue someone for a copyright infringement, they have to prove they didn't steal it, i.e. they have to prove they were the ones that came up with it originally. In places like, for example, Rwanda, and I'll talk about them in a second because they have a big pharmaceutical industry, it actually has to be that if you're suing someone, you have to prove that they stole it, i.e. it's way easier to defend yourself against patent, copyright suits in Rwanda than it is in the United States. Therefore, it just means it's easier to be inspired, i.e. you don't directly rip them off, but you definitely steal the ideas in Rwanda than it is in the United States. Here's the balance here, panel. That obviously means companies prefer to do all their research in the United States, where they have strong protections. The things that they create are much harder to be inspired from or directly steal, whereas it's much easier for other countries, like other producers, to do the inspired production in places like Rwanda. The reason that's obviously cheaper is you get to skip a bunch of the trial and error and testing and a lot of the difficulties in producing anything from pharmaceuticals, but also just general products that make people's lives better. I think on balance, what this means is as follows. When you sell a product panel, you have to register the IP in each market that you sell in. So if I produce something in the US, but I want to sell it in India, I also register the patent in India. What that means, panel, is that it prevents in the opposition world anyone being able to produce similar products anywhere in the world. I.e., if I'm someone that produces something in the US, now I'm essentially allowing my patent to be applied everywhere in the world. And Rwanda or India no longer get to set their own patent balance. What that means is as follows. In countries where you want to have weaker patent laws, the benefit is obviously that you're able to have competition based on the inspiration. I.e., in insulin, for example, you have lots of, Canada, I'm just going to go with Canada, is literally geographically next to the US, but our insulin laws are our insulin prices are about 1,000th the US. Because our patent laws are a little looser, so we have essentially knockoffs that are able to exist. That's because Canada has just broadly decided we would rather have less innovation of insulin, but at the very least we get cheaper competition to insulin. That lowers the price and makes it more affordable. What that means, panel, in countries where you don't have access to a lot of basic goods, they're willing to trade off the fact that sure, no insulin company headquarters in their country, but at the very least they are able to have greater competition from those knockoffs. Those knockoffs are likely to be cheaper because they don't have to invest in all that R&D, and therefore they're able to provide the basic needs. I think what that means, panel, is in the status quo, each country, which has the most proximate access to its own needs, and therefore knowledge of what needs need to be met and how to meet them, developing nations are able to meet the balance between things like development. So, for example, you do have countries that are somewhere in the middle, like Rwanda. Rwanda is sort of a middle ground in patent law, i.e. you can't just blatantly rip it off, but it's not super strict. Their balance is they like having manufacturing. So, the capital Kigali has a huge manufacturing plant for pharmaceuticals that they're building. They're able to do that because they're somewhere in the middle, i.e. it's still good to produce your insulin there because you're not going to have it directly stolen, even if you aren't developing it. So their priority is, for example, manufacturing. Pakistan is probably just going to have absolutely no patent law around insulin because they just need as much of it as possible because they are a generally impoverished country on average because people aren't able to afford highly expensive patented insulin. And then there's other end of the United States where they prioritize being a development hub, so they'll set really strict patent laws that only allow 1 or 2 companies to ever produce it, but at least those companies are there doing the research, paying their scientists like nice high wages. I think ultimately what that means is as follows, panel. On the opposition world, the countries that are most vulnerable, i.e. the ones that cannot survive in a world where medication or basic goods are even a fraction of a bit more expensive because people tend to have lower disposable incomes, i.e. a price going up $1 or $2 for someone in the West that makes a healthy salary doesn't really affect them. Someone that tends to live more like paycheck to paycheck in the global South, or has, for example, in a country where there are fewer social supports for dealing with things like unemployment or poverty, are far more price sensitive. So you essentially get price discrimination. And that means essentially you're able to have countries that have set lower prices by essentially structuring their IP in certain ways when they need lower prices, able to structure it in certain ways where they want higher prices but more development. I think you get more domestic industry on our side of the house in places that want to pursue that because they are able to implement strict patent laws that bring massive economic benefits. I know OG tried to frame out anything other than literally just malaria drugs, but when you talk about allowing for countries to pursue development if they want to, i.e. the countries that choose to progress from having weak to stronger patent laws as they develop, that literally means growing incomes because the development of things that end up getting patented usually is higher wage and therefore pays more, and that also looks like people able to produce manufacturing goods, even if those are low income, they are still at least provision of work and employment as a result. I think what that means, panel, is you are far more likely to get countries that meet their specific economic needs. Economics is more than just math and numbers. It is literally whether or not people have the money and the paycheck to put food on the table, and it also means that goods that are very, very important to people not dying are actually able to be priced in a way that meets the need of that country and balances their economic concerns. In a world where everyone follows the exact same patent law, i.e. it's very likely that it's going to be US style because it is these countries with the greatest capture of the global market and obviously most able to exert control, i.e. they just say, look, we're going to put every embargo on you unless you agree to this patent law, which is very strict, because the US obviously would never agree to international patent law that is very weak and destroys their advantage of being a development hub. We're very likely to live in a world where a one-size-fits-all solution fucks over everyone that doesn't happen to be Europe and the US. That is the real harm. I enacted and impacted it better than OG. So proud to stand on CG.
I thank the member of government. I invite the opposition member to defense.
Losing government's case is contingent upon two things. Number one, that the differences in law between countries actually harm the local product owners within those particular developing countries. And number two, that state bodies actually have the capacity to regulate IP laws better than international bodies. We'll prove to you why this is not true, and I'll extend to you on two things, which is number one, how IP protects technology and products in developing countries better, and secondly, regarding the lack of competition that Uni so wanted to argue about, and how we still ensure competition and in fact make it even better under our world. But before I do responses to CG, right, number one, on whether or not differences in law actually harm these local product owners, we think at the point in which internationalization happens, and whereby laws are actually supervised and monitored by the World IP Organization, this is the point in which we will actually ensure that any kind of laws that are in place are one that is suited to all countries who actually want to enter into that treaty to begin with. What happens if the country disagrees or thinks that the treaty is not actually on its side? We think that the country can refuse to sign the treaty, and that would actually benefit the country because any sort of like products within that country that might be similar to its products outside of the market will not be helped or penalized for any similarity or mock-ups that they might want to do. But secondly, when they talk about how the fact that state bodies have the capacity to regulate even better than the World IP Organization, we don't think they ever really prove this, right? Because we think in a world whereby state bodies are directly governed by the government, most likely will be corrupt, and in the circumstance whereby the state bodies are likely to be lobbied by big local companies within the states, and there is no particular international law that is governing them and telling them to do better, to regulate better, we think in those circumstances it is likelier that the state bodies will actually lead with the local major companies, and the extreme impact that they want to fight under their will, which is to prevent certain monopolies, etc., will still exist. It becomes even worse because there is nothing to protect the smaller entrepreneurs within your country. Then with this, let's move on towards what happened in opening and how we enter in closing. Opening debate talked mostly about the lack of competition and the inclusion of culture and art. We want to step away from this debate from culture and art. What exactly do we think is the most important thing? We think it is the fact that in a lot of circumstances, there are already existing businesses in developing countries that rely on a particular model, and in most circumstances, these are the particular products or technologies that are being stolen by the Western countries. We think the only way in which these businesses can be globalized and therefore can actually get the profit and recognition that they deserve is if they are protected under a global IP law. What exactly does this look like? We need to understand that IP laws, number one, don't work in perpetuity, which is what the QI does not. It only lasts for 50 years, which is why it doesn't extend to its debate about culture, art, etc. But it does extend to its products which are created as an extension of that culture or a particular society, meaning to say, if a particular medicine is designed based on Asian-centric traditions or like mediums, we are able to protect that from actually being utilized or being manipulated by the Western market and calling it one of their own because of the fact that we are able to do so. And these companies actually have the money to ensure that they are able to find the process of applying for these patents, etc., because of the fact that they want to continue making profit out of it. But secondly, we think this only applies for products or technology which is used in like a commercial manner, right? This doesn't apply to things like food, etc., whereby these are things that you can pluck out of the tree. This applies particularly if you take something that someone else already has created and call it your own, and that is the circumstance where IP laws apply, and it's important to differentiate that from any other like items that are already readily available in the market that does not require any particular manufacturer, etc., to begin with. How again was it internationalized? I think it's important to note that when you actually have a regulatory body, it's not going to be like what CG will do. It's going to be controlled solely by the US or by any other Eurocentric countries. What is going to likely happen, and it is important because of the fact that in fact a lot of other countries around the world, it has to take into account what are the different trade localities around the world and how exactly will they react to particular inclusion. The reason as to why this is true is because if this isn't true, this defeats the entire purpose of having a World IP Law Organization to begin with. We think this is important to note because of the fact that it's less likely that they will be discriminatory towards smaller developing countries, and even if they are discriminatory, we think in a lot of circumstances regulatory bodies include a lot of experts coming from different countries to actually stand guard and ensure that their laws will not be discriminating against any other developing countries. Why then does internationalization of IP law actually protect creators in the better? With this, it is true what you see. that pharmaceutical are patented and therefore this limits a lot of other people from actually using the same products. What are these instances of products or technologies of like developing countries from Southeast Asia that has competed and has done better for themselves? This looks like things like tiger bombs, for example, salon pass. These are Asian-centric products that are already patented because of the fact that they come from Asian creators or manufacturers that deserve the recognition for doing so. How exactly has this helped them? We think in the absence of IP laws to begin with, they never would have been able to ensure that their products not only stay within like Singapore or Malaysia, right, but to actually expand beyond that and actually be utilized in other Asian countries or Australia or UK, for example, because of the fact that they are the only one that is able to introduce that particular product. What would have happened if IP law didn't exist? We think it is likelier that because Western countries understand and note that these products have like significant market within Asian countries, they would actually weaponize that to their own advantage and utilize the same kind of technology to use it and sell at an even higher price because of the import prices that exist within the US and like in any other European countries. For this very reason, we think it's important to note that we are the only side that protects these business owners, and this impact matters more than opening government or than opening opposition, because we prove to you why exactly this provides a long-term impact towards these businesses insofar as they are able to profit and actually protect who actually created that product for them. But for that opening,
we tell you that this would make an IP system in which the West can specifically make sure they profit way more than any other creators, which means that medicines and things that actually save lives are the cost of this debate and the harm that outweighs the good of having a rich creator of tiger.
Alright, got it. Okay. So what we reply to that is that even if it's true that certain Western countries have the leverage over other things like pharmaceuticals, what matters is that what is made locally can continue to exist in local markets and continue to be sold at a price that is friendly towards local consumers. And everything is more important. But let's deal with the idea of like Western-centric pharmaceuticals, etc. Right? Why exactly then, even if it's dominated by Western like companies, is it still okay? We think the fact that there is a lack of competition is not as bad as we say it is, because at the point which you are willing to pay for patent to develop vaccines or to develop medicine, right, is the point which you dedicate yourself to actually ensure that whatever product that comes out of that particular company is something that is going to be worth it, something that is going to be of high quality, and something that they can sell to other countries. What happens if you don't think that the product is good enough? This is why we have like different types of vaccines, right? And these vaccines didn't just exist in Western markets, where it also had things like Sinovac, etc. coming from China, right? And in those circumstances, we see that there is a check and balance happening in the market. These check and balance and differences in patent is what makes it so high quality and ensures that they deliver the best product to the consumers. Even if it's expensive, it is important to ensure that the quality is good. Thank you.
I thank the opposition member. To close the case for the government, I invite the whip to have the floor.
One. Panel, I'm going to do a couple of things, explicit rebuttal to each team, and then explain to you why at the end of the day, CG has won this round already, based on Lachlan's case being the strongest one in the round, but also not sufficiently engaged with the team. Starting with closing opposition. I think first thing is just to point a model across both opposition teams. I don't think you can just randomly counter-model and say this is going to be basically a global IP law. The info site clearly states that this simply makes IP rights internationally applicable. That largely means that you can register for IP rights in the US, but that automatically will be applied to almost every single jurisdiction within this treaty. But if you do have a dispute in IP, it must still be sorted in the US courts, because that's necessarily where the IP was filed. You don't create an international law that's common across every country. You simply apply those rights registered in any one of the single countries to a broader system. And this is where Lachlan's mechanism comes into play as to just how this actually gets applied, which looks like companies or generally people, individuals, researchers, innovators, going to the US to register IP there because it's well protected there, to be able to then internationally apply it. So, no, we also met whatever DPM was talking about in terms of applying internationally like a Western system of like IP law. That's not necessarily what's happening. What's happening is because individuals have incentives to specifically apply for IP rights in the US, or companies either, that necessarily means that a vast majority of IP cases will be heard by US law, because that's where it was initially applied for, and necessarily the incentive is just a circular thing. That's like because they're well protected in that region. Cool. Coming to the general clash, I think it's quite simple to take out CO from the ground. Their entire case is not mutually exclusive to their side of the house, for generally two reasons. They tell you, their case being that, okay, we can have smaller economies like in Southeast Asia or like in Africa, patenting their local products on a global scale and then being able to sell in international markets. No, that already happens in a world where you don't have international IP law, by the simple mechanism of registering to sell it in a different country. Like you can literally just register in individual countries and sell your products there, right? Like there's no reason why that cannot happen on our side of the house. But additionally, right, you can also just sell it for higher prices because of the mechanism that Lachlan reached you of price discrimination. It occurs in every part of the world and it works both ways. Companies will sell same products at different prices in different markets based on either competition but also the willingness to pay within those individual markets. So if you have Asian companies registering their products in like North America, selling it in North America on our side of the house, which is all possible, they will sell it probably at the same price as they would in ops case. There's no delta from here. Coming to that opening opposition and the problem. Their first point about stealing and pirating cultures. Opening opposition is the only team who is offended on behalf of an 86-year-old woman who made a random design in some rural part of a developing country. No, principled harms matter insofar as there is an ownership of a particular culture that occurs that is then being stolen. No, with like Black Lives Matter, there's a separate factor at play in terms of literally slavery occurring and the US constantly having exploited African Americans and then stealing culture. It's not as much about taking a particular artifact or a cultural symbol and putting it on a Louis Vuitton bag. It's after the fact that there's been years and years of like massive like damage, and then in front of their very eyes, in front of the eyes of African Americans within the US, you're selling Louis Vuitton bags to them with their own symbols on it without sharing profits. It's not necessarily a case for the vast majority of your case, but principled harms do not matter in this, because if no one is going to be offended at the idea that I made a design using my culture, which I do not own, hence do not have a claim on, and selling it in the North American market. Secondly, because there is no comparative. You're telling me it's wrong to profit here off this, and the right outcome then should be to pass the profits on to the person who created it. But in your world, that does not happen. If Louis Vuitton cannot put a cultural symbol from some other part of the world on their bag without having to pay that person for it, they just won't put it, they'll put something else. The demand for Louis Vuitton bags is the demand that Louis Vuitton has for these like cultural artifacts is quite elastic. If they have to pay like some kind of like an IP tax to like get it from like a particular developing country, they'll just put something else on it, and at the end of the day, no money is transferred. But secondly, who has access to lawsuits within these developing countries that they're going to file a lawsuit against Louis Vuitton for stealing some part of their culture? There is no access even on their side of the world, so there's no delta in terms of Louis Vuitton actually not being able to get away with doing this on your side of the house as well. Lastly, art theft is generally a relatively small problem in this round compared to straight up pharmaceutical drugs, or like a broader corporate market that has significantly more at stake in terms of who's affected by it and who's benefited or who's hurt by it, right? I'll take a POI from one thing.
Yeah, they won't steal our culture now, but now we prevent the principal exploitation of Asian culture, which Asian people now care about.
No, the principal exploitation of Asian culture, or any culture, generally occurs, but at the end of the day, how do you weigh that against the straight up pragmatic harm that we tell you of people within these countries not being able to access the most basic products? Because that was your second point. Let me deal with that, right? You tell me that, okay, transfer of technology only occurs when you know rights are protected. Like, that was their case, being like, oh, if you don't know that IP law is respected in this country, we won't just sell our product there. Lachlan already deals with this when he tells you you can just register individually in that country and then be able to sell access. Oh, then is out of the run. I'll take CO's POI. Do you have anything? No? Cool. Final wing against OG and why our impacts on our mechanization generally just beats them. They talk about access to medicine, but they don't necessarily have the mechanization. They fall into the same trap as OO and tell you that, okay, the differentiating factor here is that either a company will sell or won't sell. That's not the differentiating factor. Lachlan clearly tells you the way this mechanizes is you have individuals who will file for like rights within the US and then sell in domestic markets because that's a natural factor in terms of expanding the market. The difference between the two sides is the price at which it is sold in those developing countries, right? On their side of the house, when they're the only competitors, they're the only individuals in the market with a product that is a lot of the times just necessary or highly demanded within developing countries, they're able to price gouge. They're able to charge a price that consumers will just be forced to cough up, even if they can't afford it, even if it's at the cost of lower quantity. The goal is to maximize profits as a whole. Secondly, Secondly, it's not just comparatively then on our side, what you get is competition, right? It does generally means you have local industries that can make similar products, even if they're inferior quality, can make alternatives that are cheaper for people, but the fact that the cheaper alternative exists in and of itself makes these good quality products from the West also sell at cheaper prices. This is price discrimination in the real world, how profits are maximized across economies. But lastly, we don't even need the competition to exist. We simply need the threat of the competition to exist for companies to automatically lower prices to the point where it discourages competition from entering, but the prices are still low. The impact of the round, best coming from CG, we have significantly lower prices of products because we take away monopoly power from individual companies that register in the West and sell into the global South. At the end of the day, that is what changes the difference between you being able to afford insulin versus not. Being able to afford a necessary product versus not. That is why we win this debate. We're so proud to propose.
I thank the government whip for this debate. I invite the opposition whip to address.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think at this point in the round, it's just best to do a case-by-case basis and compare all the teams and prove to you why extension was extremely valuable and maybe weigh up basically the material in this round. Number one, let's respond to OG. And I think this is important and wasn't given enough credit. When it talked about the health and agriculture being important factors when it came to people's lives and people being able to, I guess, live good lives. The fact of the matter is, okay, the first response to this is that they never really analyzed the incentive structure of research and development, and basically the incentive structure of people on the top to invest in these in these corporations when they want to produce vaccines or produce agriculture without a certain a large blanket of IP protection laws. What's more likely to happen on their world is that when you don't internationalize IP laws, and we take their best case, which is that individual countries have their specific IP laws that cater to their own economic needs, is that you don't get to, protect your individual product across all of these countries. What this looks like on the ground is that when we look at the vaccinations and vaccines, the reason why vaccines were able to be produced so quickly, like 2 months or 3 months after the COVID-19 had happened, was because all of these corporations were protected by heavy IP laws, which incentivized them to actually do proactive research and development. This is quintessential in taking down OG's case. Because point in which where there is no proactive incentive to do research and development is the point in which where the urgency of the matter and the people's lives that are basically destroyed are quantifiably more in that sense. What's more likely on their side than in the comparative is that these research institutions or governments in this instance will be more reactive when it comes to producing life-saving fertilizer that will help a drought, or producing or life-saving vaccines that react to a certain development. But because on our world where we're able to have international bodies like WIPO or international agreements like TRIPS that actually bind all of these countries together, there is a level of security that gives investors the ability to invest in these corporations even when it is proactive, even when there is no when the benefit and the profit is speculative. That is something that is important that came from us. Takes out OG. No, thank you. Moving on to the next part of weighing opening opposition. Notice opening opposition's case is protecting minorities, but like the government had acknowledged that IP laws have a time limit, which means to say that probably 50 years, which means that culture isn't really protected by IP laws. But if their best case on an OO is the amount of the principle and the dignity of Asians and protecting that, we think that we'll be able to win when we weigh the amount of lives that we can save because of the explanation that we can activate in our world. Now moving on to the comparison with CG. CG's main case is price discrimination, and because these entrepreneurs are smart fellas, they are able to basically register in domains that have more strict IP laws, and then sell their products in domains that don't have as strict IP laws because they're able to get more profit or something like that in that instance. I think that doesn't make sense really, because number one, if you opt into this TRIPS agreement, that means that you have to follow the guidelines and follow the agreements that probably will be restrictive on you as a corporation. If that is so what that means is that on their world they're trying to claim a benefit of profits happening, or no, they're trying to pose a harm that profits will be exploited. But the problem is which they don't acknowledge the fact that these agreements have been reviewed by multiple law experts, have been reviewed and have been binding throughout not just their country, but a multitude of countries, which means that they have to be solid and not have any loopholes, which means to say that a lot of their main sell doesn't really happen. But before I move on, I'll take one from opening for engagement.
We give you multiple reasons that innovation persists. States have alternative funding models, innovations are still profitable in the same way that starting a business is, and domestic IP law exists.
Yeah, I think my whole response to your case also exists, which is that your innovation will be reactive to problems that happen, whereas our innovation will be proactive, which means to say that there is no impetus for you to react or innovate when there is no problem that exists, whereas on our, because our protection is larger, that means that entrepreneurs, from smaller entrepreneurs to the larger entrepreneurs, will have more of an impetus to get more, or more, like, I guess, ability to get money from investors and angel investors of that sort, which is that direct comparative. But moving on to what our positive material that we brought to you in closing opposition, I think it's important to note how Anis framed these small entrepreneurs and why they're actually being impacted by this like subversion of laws, or like not wanting to internationalize laws. Because at the point in which where you acknowledge that these developing countries are quite behind the developed countries when it comes to development and when it comes to like their own specialization and their own products, is the point in which where you also have to acknowledge that in status quo, billionaires and people that are rich in these developing countries that were able to make it were because they were able to like be protected by laws and not get ripped off by like the US or like countries that are already in that assignment. I think it's important at the end of the day that innovation is, or that we've proved to you that innovation is being able to be increased in that aspect. Before I move on for closing for engagement.
So presumably the fact that businesses exist in the global south means that you are still profitable if you produce a knockoff of another company. But importantly, it keeps those prices low and accessible and fills the holes in the market.
I think that number one, you have to also compete with like other knockoffs, right? If that's your main case. But the point in which where your main case is that like a comparative advantage in specialization of laws, then you also have to like talk about and compete with like bigger knockoff producers like China or like Indonesia in of itself. Like we don't deny that there are people or there are countries that will have knockoffs. What we do deny is that in the larger scheme of things, when those knockoffs are important, or when the incentive for investors to invest into these important vaccines and important fertilizers, or even important like small Asian entrepreneurial businesses, is the point in which where we are able to take that cake because we're able to secure the investors and their money better. We're able to ensure that their money is protected in that instance. But lastly and most importantly, at the end of the day, like it's just illegal if you think about it. If you want to like co-opt a jurisdiction that has co-opt the jurisdiction that has strict laws when you register, and suddenly want that those strict laws to apply to all of the other countries in that instance. So that doesn't really make sense. But other than that, very proud to oppose.
Alright, thanks Albert, and thanks everyone for the debate. Yeah, hit to wherever you guys want to be. I think we're ready.
So,